The distress beacon had been dead for 6 months. That was the first thing that told me this was not a rescue job. The second thing was the size of the object on our scanner. Nothing that big should be floating dark in the Kessner Drift without someone looking for it. Nothing that big gets forgotten, unless someone chose to forget it. My name is Danny Cole. I run a 4-person salvage crew on a ship called the Debt Collector, and on that particular day, 900 light-years from Earth, we were broke. Not the romantic kind of broke where you skip a meal and laugh about it later over drinks. The dangerous kind. Our fuel cells had 11 days of charge left. Our food printer was running on recycled protein paste that tasted like wet cardboard mixed with regret. Our docking fees at Kovac Station were 3 months overdue, and the dockmaster had stopped returning my calls, which is never a good sign. We needed a score. Any score. Something to keep us flying for another month, another week, another day. So when Pete Harmon, my pilot, looked up from the scanner console with wide eyes and said there was a mass signature out in the drift that was bigger than anything he had ever seen, I did not ask questions. I did not check the charts. I did not run a risk assessment. I told him to change course immediately. The Kessner Drift is a graveyard. Not for people, thankfully. For ships. It is a thick belt of shattered hulls, spent fuel pods, broken satellites, and general cosmic garbage that stretches across 40 million kilometers of dead space between the Veldron trade corridor and the outer human colonies. Salvage crews like mine pick through it for scraps the way people used to pick through junkyards back on Earth. A good week means finding an intact power coupling or a crate of undamaged hull plating. A great week means finding a working navigation module that some alien trader will buy for enough credits to cover a month of fuel. Most weeks are not good weeks. What we found that day was something else entirely. It came into view on our forward cameras slowly, because Pete brought us in at a cautious crawl. Lena Marsh, my tech specialist, ran every scan she could think of while we approached. No radiation spikes, no weapons signatures, no active shielding, no life signs, no power emissions above minimal reserve levels. Just a massive, silent shape sitting in the drift, like it had always been there, like the debris field had formed around it, like the universe had built a nest for something it wanted to hide. It was a Veldron heavy cruiser. I need you to understand what those words mean, because saying them does not do them justice. The Veldron are one of the 3 dominant species in the Galactic Concord, the interstellar governing body that keeps the peace between civilizations, that could destroy each other if they chose to. The Veldron do not build ships the way humans do. They do not weld metal plates together and bolt on engines. They grow their ships. Every curve of a Veldron hull is formed from crystalline composites that are cultivated over years in zero-gravity foundries, layer by layer, molecule by molecule. Their engineers do not call themselves engineers. They call themselves architects, and they treat each vessel like a work of art. A Veldron heavy cruiser represents decades of effort and resources that most human colonies could not match in a century. And one was sitting in a junk belt with its lights off, abandoned, forgotten, left to drift like a soda can tossed from a car window. Lena identified the ship from its hull markings. It was called the Cephas Vaughn, a Horizon-class cruiser built for deep space operations, long-range patrols, power projection, the kind of ship that shows up in a star system and makes every other ship in that system very polite very quickly. Its crew complement was rated at 200. Its weapons included 6 primary particle lance arrays, 12 secondary batteries, and a defensive shield system that was considered among the best in the galaxy. I asked Lena why it was dark. She said she did not know. There was no battle damage on the hull, no debris field from an engagement, no residual weapons signatures. The ship had not been attacked. Something else had happened. We docked through a maintenance airlock on the port side. The seal was clean, and the pressure on the other side was stable, which meant life support was running on some kind of reserve power. I took Lena and Owen Price, my mechanic, and we stepped inside with handheld lights and scanning equipment, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you are walking into something valuable and not understanding why it was left behind. The interior of that ship was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and it made my stomach turn with unease. The corridors were wide and gently curved, lit by a faint blue glow from bioluminescent strips embedded in the walls. The air smelled like ozone, and something faintly sweet, like flowers from a planet I had never visited. Everything was clean, not just clean, immaculate. There were no scorch marks, no blast damage, no signs of combat or catastrophe anywhere. No bodies, no personal belongings left behind in haste, no signs of panic or emergency evacuation. The crew had not fled. They had packed up their things and walked away in an orderly fashion, like guests checking out of a hotel. Owen said it gave him the creeps. He said it felt like walking through a house where someone had died peacefully in their sleep and nobody had noticed yet. I agreed with him, but did not say so out loud, because one of us needed to look like they were in control of the situation, and since I was technically the captain, that job fell to me. We moved through the ship for 2 hours, checking every section methodically. Bridge, crew quarters, medical bay, weapons deck, secondary command center, cargo holds. Everything was intact. Everything was operational at minimum power. The ship was a ghost town made of crystal and light, and the longer we explored it, the less sense it made. Then we reached the drive core, and everything became clear. The Veldron faster-than-light drive is built around something called a resonance matrix. It is a single enormous crystal, about 2 meters tall, grown over decades in a specialized facility specifically for each individual ship. No two crystals are alike. Each one is tuned to the precise harmonic frequency of the hull it was designed for, and that crystal vibrates at that frequency to bend space around the vessel, allowing faster-than-light travel. Every major system on a Veldron ship is synchronized to the crystal's frequency. Weapons, shields, navigation, life support, gravity plating, communications, everything flows through the crystal. It is not just the engine, it is the heart, the brain, and the spine of the ship all in one. The Sethis Vaughn's crystal was cracked. Not a hairline fracture, not a minor flaw. A deep, branching crack that ran from the base of the crystal to nearly the top, splitting into dozens of smaller fractures like a frozen lightning bolt trapped inside glass. The crystal still glowed with a pale blue light. It still hummed, but the sound was wrong. Even I, with no training in Veldron crystal mechanics, could hear the difference. Instead of the pure, steady tone that a healthy resonance matrix produces, this one wavered. It stuttered. It pulsed in irregular patterns. It sounded like a heartbeat that kept skipping, like something alive and in pain. Lena put her hand on the crystal housing and pulled it back quickly. She ran a scan and told me the harmonic output was completely destabilized. The crystal was still producing its primary frequency, but the fractures were generating dozens of secondary vibrations, overtones and interference patterns that bled into every connected system. She said it was like trying to listen to a conversation in a room full of people all talking at the same time. The signal was still there, but the noise was overwhelming it. I stood in front of that cracked crystal for a long time, thinking. Then I contacted the nearest Veldron trade station on the ship's own communication array, which still worked, because it drew power from the reserves rather than the crystal. It took 4 hours to get a response. When it came, the Veldron liaison sounded offended that I had bothered to ask. His tone carried the particular flavor of contempt that the Veldron reserve for species they consider beneath their notice, which is most of them. He told me the Sethis Vaughn had been formally decommissioned. A fractured resonance matrix, he explained with exaggerated patience, could not be repaired. The crystal was unique to that specific ship, and growing a replacement would take 30 standard years. Without a functioning matrix, the ship could not achieve FTL. Without FTL, a Veldron warship had no purpose. It was, in his exact words, like a bird with no wings, decorative at best, embarrassing at worst. They had removed the crew, stripped the classified data cores, and left the hull in the drift. I asked if they wanted it back. I asked if they had any plans to retrieve or recycle the vessel. He said, and I will never forget this because his voice carried absolute certainty, that bringing a crippled vessel home would be like carrying a corpse into a wedding hall. He said the Sethis Vaughn was dead, and the dead should be left where they fall. He said the Veldron did not mourn machines. I thanked him and closed the channel. Then I sat in the captain's chair on the bridge of a dead alien warship and thought about what he had said. The crystal was cracked. The ship could not fly at FTL. By Veldron standards, that made it worthless. A broken thing. A corpse. something to be abandoned and forgotten because perfection was the only acceptable standard, and this ship had fallen below it. I looked at the bridge around me. The consoles still glowed. The air still flowed. The hull was unbreached. The weapons unfired. The armor unscratched. This ship had more raw potential in one weapons array than my entire salvage rig had in its wildest dreams. And they had thrown it away because one component was damaged. Owen came onto the bridge and asked me what I wanted to do. He said we could strip some of the smaller components, sell them at Kovac Station, and make enough to cover our debts. He said that was the smart play. I told him we were going to claim the ship under Deep Space Salvage Law, Article 9, Section 14. Abandoned vessels in unclaimed space with no active retrieval beacon, no distress signal, and no scheduled recovery operation are legal salvage for whoever finds them. He looked at me like I had lost my mind. He pointed out that we were 4 people with a falling-apart salvage ship, and I wanted to claim a Veldron heavy cruiser. He asked what exactly we were going to do with a warship that could not fly. I told him we were going to fix it. He laughed. Then he saw my face, and the laugh died in his throat. He asked me if I was serious. Lena had been standing in the doorway, listening. She said fixing a fractured resonance matrix was impossible. The Veldron themselves, the species that invented the technology, said it could not be done. She said we did not have the tools, the knowledge, the facilities, or the technology. She said the molecular structure of the crystal was too complex, too delicate, and too alien for any human technique to repair. I said we were not going to repair the crystal. She frowned. She asked what I meant. I said we were going to work around it. The crystal was cracked. Fine. We could not fix the crack. Fine. But the crystal was still producing energy, still vibrating, still generating a harmonic field. It was unstable, chaotic, unpredictable, but it was not dead. And if there is one thing humans know how to do, it is work with broken equipment. We have been doing it since we were banging rocks together on the savannah. Our entire civilization is built on the principle of making things work, despite the fact that they should not. Lena stared at me for a long time. Then she tilted her head to the side, the way she always did when she was running calculations in her mind, and she said she was listening. That night, I filed the salvage claim from the bridge of the Sethis Vaughn. It went into the Galactic Concord Registry without challenge, without objection, without a single inquiry. Nobody else wanted the ship. Nobody in the entire galaxy wanted a broken Veldron cruiser with a cracked heart. Nobody except 4 humans who were too stubborn, too broke, and too desperate to know any better. I stood at the forward viewport and looked out at the drift. The stars were cold and distant, and did not care about us or our plans. But the ship hummed beneath my feet, that broken, wavering, unsteady hum from the cracked crystal deep in its core, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. They saw a corpse, I saw a patient. And I have never been the kind of man who walks away from something that still has a heartbeat. It took us 3 weeks to tow the Sethis Vaughn to Kovac Station, and when we arrived, the dockmaster nearly choked on his coffee. I do not blame him. Kovac Station is a human-operated repair and trade platform on the edge of the outer colonies, a sprawling, noisy, overcrowded orbital structure, held together by welding patches, second-hand parts, and the collective stubbornness of about 12,000 permanent residents, who are all too poor or too proud to live anywhere nicer. The ships that dock there are freighters, mining rigs, cargo haulers, and salvage vessels. They are working ships with dented hulls and engines that rattle and groan. The Sethis Vaughn, with its gleaming crystalline hull and sweeping alien architecture, looked like a diamond ring dropped in a toolbox. The dockmaster's name was Frank Ellison, a heavy-set man with a gray beard and permanently grease-stained hands. He stood at his console staring at the Veldron cruiser through his viewport for a full minute before he turned to me and asked if I was joking. I told him I was not joking and showed him the salvage claim. He read it twice, looked at me, looked at the ship, looked at me again, and then said his docking bays were not big enough for something that size. I told him I knew that. He asked me what I expected him to do about it. I told him we would figure it out together. We improvised. We anchored the Sethis Vaughn to the station's exterior structural frame, using heavy-duty tethering cables rated for asteroid mining operations. Owen and I spent 2 days rigging the cables, while Pete held the ship steady with the debt collector's maneuvering thrusters. Then we built a pressurized work corridor between the station and the ship's port airlock, using prefabricated tunnel sections that Frank sourced from a decommissioned mining platform. It was ugly. It leaked air at 3 of the joints. Owen patched the leaks with sealant and duct tape. It worked. The first month was assessment. Lena and I went through every system on the ship, deck by deck, compartment by compartment, running diagnostics and cataloging what worked, what did not, and what was somewhere in between. The Veldron had stripped their classified data cores before abandoning the vessel, but they had left everything else intact. Navigation systems, weapons arrays, propulsion systems, shield generators, environmental controls, gravity plating, sensor suites. All of it was physically present and technically functional, and all of it was unreliable because the fractured crystal made the entire ship's harmonic foundation unstable. Let me explain this clearly, because it is the key to everything that came after. Imagine a building where every electrical system, every water pipe, every ventilation duct, every elevator is connected to a single central generator that produces a steady, perfect 60 Hz electrical current. Every system in the building is designed to run on that exact frequency. The lights expect 60 Hz. The computers expect 60 Hz. The water pumps, the air handlers, the security locks, everything. Now imagine the generator gets damaged, and instead of producing a clean 60 Hz signal, it starts producing 60 Hz plus 43 Hz plus 71 Hz plus a dozen other random frequencies layered on top. Every system in the building starts behaving unpredictably. Lights flicker, computers glitch, pumps stutter. Elevators stop between floors. Nothing is truly broken in isolation, but the corrupted power signal makes everything unreliable. That was the Cephas Vaughn. The cracked crystal was still producing its designed primary frequency, but the fractures were generating dozens of secondary harmonic frequencies that bled into every connected system and made them all behave erratically. The Veldron solution would be to replace the crystal with a new, perfect one. We did not have a perfect crystal, and we did not have 30 years to grow one. What we had was Owen Price, who once fixed a freighter's leaking coolant system with a zip tie, a piece of rubber hose from the kitchen, and a prayer. And we had Lena Marsh, who held a doctorate in xenoengineering from the University of New Geneva, and possessed absolutely no fear of breaking things that were already broken. In week 5, Lena came to me with a proposal that made Owen's jaw drop. She wanted to fill the fractures in the crystal with industrial polymer resin. Not to repair the crystal. She was very clear about that. The molecular structure of the crystal was too complex for any material to restore, but she could stabilize it physically. She compared it to putting a cast on a broken bone. The bone is still broken, but the cast prevents the fracture from spreading. It holds the pieces in alignment. It gives the body time and stability. She wanted to pour human-manufactured glue into the most sophisticated piece of alien technology any of us had ever seen. Owen said that was either the most brilliant idea he had ever heard or the most reckless. He said he genuinely could not tell which. I told him it did not matter. I told him to start mixing the resin. We spent a full week on that single step. Lena calculated thermal expansion rates to make sure the resin would not crack when the crystal heated during operation. She measured harmonic absorption coefficients to ensure the resin would not dampen the crystal's vibrations below functional levels. She tested 7 different resin formulations on crystal samples that Owen carefully shaved from the edges of the fractures, using a dental drill he borrowed from the station's medical bay. Owen designed a delivery system using modified hull sealant injectors, thin nozzles that could reach deep into the fracture channels and fill them evenly from the bottom up. I held the lights during the procedure and tried not to think about what the Veldron would say if they could see 3 humans standing around their sacred crystal with caulk guns and a dental drill. The resin set over 48 hours. The crystal held. The fractures did not spread. Lena monitored the output and confirmed that the harmonic profile had not significantly changed. The crystal was still producing its chaotic mix of frequencies, but it was physically stable now. The cracks were frozen in place, locked in resin that would hold them for years. Step 1 was complete. Step 2 was harder. The crystal was still producing chaotic harmonics, and every system on the ship was still reacting unpredictably to the corrupted signal. The Veldron design philosophy was one crystal, one frequency, one unified system. If the crystal was imperfect, everything was imperfect. There was no workaround built into their engineering, because they never needed one. Their technology did not fail. That was their fundamental assumption, and they had built everything around it. Humans have a different fundamental assumption. Our assumption is that everything fails eventually, and the question is not whether something will break, but what you do when it does. I brought in 2 more people. Nate Kelly was a software engineer I had worked with 3 years earlier on a cargo hauler refit at Kovac Station. He was thin, intense, and survived primarily on caffeine and an inexhaustible fascination with making computers do things they were not designed to do. Katie Ford was a former military systems technician who had been dishonorably discharged from the Colonial Defense Force for making unauthorized modifications to a patrol ship's weapons targeting array. The modifications had tripled the ship's accuracy ratings. Her commanding officer had not appreciated the initiative. I did. Katie was the kind of person who looked at a locked door and immediately started thinking about which wall was thinnest. She did not solve problems the way they were supposed to be solved. She solved them the way that worked. I needed exactly that kind of thinking. Nate tackled the software problem. The Veldron control systems expected a single, clean input frequency from the crystal. When they received multiple frequencies, they stuttered, glitched, and produced unpredictable outputs. The Veldron solution would have been to fix the crystal. Nate's solution was to put a translator between the crystal and the ship. He wrote an adaptive software layer, a program that sat between the crystal's output and the ship's control systems. The software monitored the crystal's harmonic output thousands of times per second, identified the primary frequency from the noise, and adjusted every connected system in real time to compensate for the fluctuations. It was like building an automatic tuner that constantly corrected a radio station that refused to stay on its assigned frequency. Every millisecond, the software sampled the crystal, calculated the deviation from the expected frequency, and sent compensating signals to every system on the ship. The Veldron had never needed such software. Their crystals never drifted, but Nate built it in 3 weeks, running on 5 hours of sleep per night and a level of caffeinated determination that concerned everyone around him. When he plugged it into the ship's network and activated it, the lights on the Sethis Vaughn stopped flickering for the first time since we had come aboard. The consoles steadied. The gravity plating held firm. The air recyclers stopped their rhythmic stuttering and settled into a smooth, constant hum. Katie handled the hardware side. She looked at the Veldron's elegant unified control architecture, the single integrated system that routed every command through the crystal, and she called it a single point of failure. Then she tore it out. Not all of it. She kept the Veldron hardware where it was superior to anything we could replace it with, which was most places. But she broke the unified control chain into modular segments. She installed redundant human processors at critical junctions. She added independent circuit pathways that could bypass the crystal entirely for non-essential systems. She welded in manual override switches for every critical function on the ship, so that if the software failed, if the crystal hiccuped, if everything went wrong simultaneously, a human hand on a physical switch could still keep life support running, still fire the weapons, still steer the ship. The Veldron design philosophy was one perfect system that never fails. Katie's philosophy was 12 backup systems, each one ugly and crude and individually inferior, so that when System 1 fails, and System 2 fails, and System 3 goes down, System 4 keeps you breathing long enough to fix the other 3. It was not pretty. I want to emphasize this. The interior of the Sethis Vaughn went from looking like a cathedral to looking like someone had opened up the walls and stuffed them with tangled wiring. Human cables ran alongside Veldron conduits, held in place with cable ties and adhesive clips. Human display screens were bolted next to alien holographic projectors. Owen welded mounting brackets directly onto surfaces that the Veldron had probably spent years polishing to a mirror finish. Every room on the ship had at least one piece of human equipment that clashed violently with the alien aesthetics around it. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever built. By month 3, we had basic systems running reliably. Life support was stable and tuned for human atmospheric preferences. Gravity plating worked on every deck except Deck 4, which intermittently reversed itself for reasons that Nate was still investigating. Navigation was online and responding accurately. Sublight engines accepted commands and produced thrust within expected parameters. The weapons arrays were powered, but untested, because firing a Veldron particle lance inside a station's docking zone would be a fast way to make enemies of everyone within 50 kilometers. We had a working ship. It shuddered slightly when it accelerated. It groaned when Pete turned it too sharply. Half the displays still showed data in Veldron script that we could only partially translate. The environmental system kept trying to adjust the atmosphere to Veldron preferences, which were warmer and more humid than humans like, until Katie hardwired a bypass that locked it to Earth-standard parameters. But it worked, against every prediction, against the considered judgment of the most advanced engineering civilization in the known galaxy. Our glued-together, jury-rigged, cable-tied mess of a ship worked. And then Lena found something that changed everything. She had been monitoring the crystal continuously since we stabilized it, obsessively tracking every frequency it produced, mapping every harmonic overtone the fractures generated. She had filled 3 data drives with readings. On an ordinary afternoon, while the rest of us were eating reconstituted noodles in the mess hall, she called me down to the drive core. Her voice over the communicator was trying very hard to sound calm, and it was failing completely. She showed me her analysis on a display screen. The original crystal, before it cracked, had produced a single frequency. One clean, powerful, perfectly stable tone that drove the ship's FTL system at its rated speed. The cracked crystal was producing that primary frequency, but layered on top of it were 17 additional harmonic frequencies generated by the fracture patterns. These overtones were what made the ship's systems unstable. They were the noise that Nate's software was constantly filtering out and compensating for. But Lena had been studying those overtones for months now, and she had realized something remarkable. They were not random noise. The fracture patterns in the crystal had created a complex but consistent set of secondary frequencies that interacted with the primary frequency in structured, mathematical ways. The relationships between the frequencies followed patterns that Lena recognized from harmonic theory. The cracked crystal was not producing chaos. It was producing a chord. A complex, rich, multi-layered harmonic chord that no intact Veldron crystal had ever generated, because intact crystals only played one note. The cracked crystal was not weaker than the original. It was more complex. It was producing a denser, richer harmonic field than any functioning resonance matrix in the Veldron fleet. I asked her what that meant in practical terms. What could we do with a crystal that played 17 notes instead of 1? She said she was not entirely sure yet, but her preliminary mathematical models suggested that if we could harness those overtones, channel them deliberately instead of just compensating for them, the drive system could potentially operate at levels far beyond its original design specifications. I looked at the cracked crystal humming in its housing. It glowed with that unsteady, wavering blue light that I had grown so used to over the past months. I thought about the Veldron liaison who had called this ship a corpse, who had said the dead should be left where they fall. That night, I went down to the main cargo bay with a bucket of white hull paint and a wide brush. I climbed the exterior scaffolding that Owen had welded to the port side and painted over the Veldron name on the hull, covering those elegant alien characters with thick, dripping strokes of white. Then, underneath the fresh white, I painted our name in rough block letters. The paint dripped and ran in the low gravity, and the letters were crooked and uneven, and they were the most honest thing on that ship. Junkyard Dog. Pete was the first to see it when he came out for his shift. He laughed so hard he had to brace himself against the scaffolding to keep from floating away. Katie took a picture with her personal datapad. Nate said it was perfect. Owen said we were all certifiably insane, and then he asked if he could paint the starboard side. The Veldron built a violin. We broke it and turned it into a war drum. And we had not even started playing yet. Lena spent 2 more weeks buried in harmonic analysis before she was ready to explain her findings to the full crew. When she finally called us together in the engine room, all 6 of us standing around the cracked crystal in its housing, she spoke in the slow, deliberate way she always used when she was trying to make something deeply complex sound straightforward. The Veldron resonance matrix, she said, was designed to be perfect. One crystal, One frequency, one pure tone, one purpose. The entire architecture of every Veldron ship was built around that single, clean harmonic. It was elegant, it was efficient, and it was, in her words, like building a piano with only one key. The key played its note beautifully, flawlessly, every single time, but it could only ever play that one note. The fractures in our crystal had given it 17 additional keys. She had been mapping the overtone frequencies against the ship's propulsion architecture, running thousands of simulations, testing every combination. Her models showed that the FTL drive did not just respond to the primary frequency, it could respond to harmonic combinations, specific chords played by combining the primary tone with selected overtones. The original Veldron designers had never explored this, because their crystals never cracked. They never had multiple frequencies to work with. They never even considered the possibility, because perfection was their starting assumption and their ending conclusion. But Lena's data showed that certain combinations of frequencies could push the FTL drive field into geometric configurations that were physically impossible with a single tone. The drive field could be shaped, sculpted, optimized for different purposes depending on which harmonic combination was active. Nate asked what that meant in numbers. Lena pulled up a holographic projection that showed the standard FTL performance envelope for the Cetus Vaughn in its original configuration. It was fast by Galactic standards, one of the quickest ship classes in the Veldron fleet. Then she overlaid a second projection, showing the theoretical performance envelope using the harmonic combinations she had identified. The room went quiet. The second envelope was not just larger, it was dramatically larger. Her models predicted a speed increase of at least 70% over the ship's original FTL rating, with some harmonic combinations suggesting even higher potential. The junkyard dog, if her math was right, could outrun every ship in the known galaxy. Not by a small margin, by a gap so wide that pursuit would be pointless. Owen whistled low and long. He said that was impossible. Lena said the math disagreed with him. Then she said the part that made the room even quieter. The weapons would be affected too. The Veldron particle lances were designed to fire at the crystal's primary frequency, a single, precise energy beam tuned to one specific wavelength. That beam was powerful, accurate, and devastating. It was also predictable. Every species in the galaxy had spent centuries developing shields specifically calibrated to block Veldron weapon frequencies. The galactic arms race between Veldron weapons and everyone else's shields had been going on for hundreds of years and had reached a stable equilibrium. Veldron lances could eventually punch through most shields, but it took sustained fire, precise targeting, and time. Defenders knew what frequency was coming and built their defenses accordingly. But what happened when the lance did not fire at one frequency? What happened when it fired at 18 simultaneously? Lena explained that the multi-frequency output from the cracked crystal could be channeled through the weapons arrays to produce a beam that shifted its energy frequency thousands of times per second. It would not be the clean, surgical lance the Veldron designed. It would be a chaotic, rapidly modulating stream of energy that hit its target with a different frequency every millisecond. Standard shields throughout the galaxy were designed to block specific, known frequencies. They were tuned like radio receivers, set to reject the signals they expected to encounter. A beam that constantly changed its frequency would be like trying to block a radio signal that jumped to a new channel 1,000 times per second. The shields simply could not adapt fast enough. Katie leaned forward when she heard this. Her eyes were sharp and focused and slightly frightening. She asked Lena to repeat the part about shields not being able to adapt. Lena repeated it. Katie said one word. She said beautiful. We needed to test everything, but testing meant taking the ship into open space and pushing it, which meant trusting our lives to a cracked crystal stabilized with glue, an adaptive software layer written by a sleep-deprived programmer, and a hardware architecture that looked like it had been assembled during a natural disaster. We took the junkyard dog out of Kovac Station on a morning that felt cold, even though temperature has no meaning in space. Pete sat in the pilot's chair, which we had fitted with human-sized cushion inserts, because Veldron are considerably taller than us, and the original seat left Pete's feet dangling 6 inches off the floor. Nate was at the systems management console, his eyes locked on the adaptive software readouts. Lena was in the drive room standing next to the crystal, monitoring its output directly. Katie was at the weapons station, her hands resting on the firing controls with a patience that was either professional discipline or barely contained excitement. Owen was roaming between decks with his toolkit and a communicator, ready to fix whatever broke first, and probably whatever broke second and third as well. I stood on the bridge behind Pete and tried to project the confident calm of a captain who knew exactly what he was doing. I did not know exactly what I was doing, but I knew it needed to be done. We cleared Kovac Station's sensor perimeter and moved into open space, well away from shipping lanes and inhabited zones. Pete ran the sublight engines through a progressive throttle test, starting at 10% and incrementing by 10. The ship responded smoothly through the first 5 steps. At 60%, a deep vibration started in the hull, a resonance you felt in your chest and your teeth, rather than heard with your ears. Nate's software compensated, adjusting the harmonic balance, and the vibration settled to a faint tremor. At full sublight power, the junkyard dog was faster on conventional engines than any ship its size had a right to be. Then, we tested FTL. I gave the order because someone had to give it, and I was the one standing at the front of the bridge trying to look authoritative. Pete engaged the FTL drive sequence. In the drive room, the cracked crystal began spinning up to full output, and even through 3 decks of crystalline hull plating, I could hear it. It was not the clean, pure, single note that Veldron crystals were supposed to sing. It was a chord, rough and deep and complex, like an orchestra tuning up in a storm. The bridge lights flickered once, hard, and then steadied. The FTL transition hit us like running into a wall at full speed. The Veldron FTL experience is supposed to feel like sliding into warm water. A gentle, smooth, almost pleasant sensation as the drive field envelops the ship and bends space around it. That is what the brochure says anyway. Our transition felt like being shoved through a keyhole by a very impatient giant. The ship lurched violently. The inertial dampeners screamed at a frequency that suggested they were approaching their design limits. Every unsecured object on the bridge, which included a coffee cup, a datapad, 2 styluses, and Owen's sandwich, flew sideways and hit the port wall. Pete grabbed his console with both hands. I grabbed the railing behind him and held on until my knuckles ached. Then the turbulence stopped, and we were in FTL. The view screen showed the stretched, smeared starlight of superluminal travel, beautiful in a way that never gets old no matter how many times you see it. The ship hummed around us, steady now, the chaotic chord of the crystal settling into something that almost sounded like music. Nate was staring at his sensor readouts with an expression I had never seen on his face before. His mouth was slightly open, and his eyes were moving rapidly back and forth across the data, checking it, rechecking it, checking it a 3rd time. I asked him what he saw. He said we had exceeded the ship's original rated FTL speed. I asked by how much. He said 74%. The junkyard dog, an abandoned, broken, glued together, jury-rigged wreck that the most advanced shipbuilding civilization in the galaxy had thrown away like garbage, was now traveling faster than any Veldron cruiser in active service. Not slightly faster, not marginally faster, dramatically, unmistakably, embarrassingly faster. Lena's voice came over the communicator from the drive room. She sounded breathless, like she had just sprinted up a flight of stairs, which was her default state when the data confirmed something she had predicted. She said the crystal was stable. The overtone harmonics were feeding into the FTL drive field exactly as her models had calculated. The fractures were not degrading the drive performance, they were amplifying it. The cracks were creating a drive field geometry that no intact crystal could produce, because an intact crystal did not have the harmonic complexity to generate it. I asked her to confirm in plain language. She said the damage was the upgrade. Pete dropped us out of FTL in a patch of empty space far from anything important. The exit transition was rough, like the entry, a hard jolt that rattled the hull and knocked Owen's sandwich remains off the wall where they had been stuck. But we were intact. Everything was functional. Nate's software had held. Katie's redundant systems had held. The crystal had held. Then we tested the weapons. Katie had been waiting for this moment since Lena's briefing. She had spent weeks studying the Veldron particle lance architecture, reverse engineering the firing protocols, and modifying the targeting systems to handle multi-frequency output. She had run simulations until she could recite the numbers in her sleep, and now she finally had a chance to test it for real. She selected an asteroid, approximately 12 kilometers off our starboard bow, not a small one, a chunk of iron and silicate, roughly 300 meters across, dense enough that standard weapons would need sustained fire to do significant damage. She asked for permission to fire. I gave it. The beam that erupted from our forward lance array was unlike anything I had ever seen in combat footage, training materials, or technical specifications. Veldron particle lances produce a clean, bright, tightly focused beam of coherent energy, beautiful in a terrible way, like a laser cutting through glass. Our beam was different. It was wider, rougher, and it shimmered, like the air above hot pavement on a summer day. That shimmer was the frequency modulation, thousands of shifts per second, the energy beam constantly changing its signature faster than any sensor or shield generator could track. The beam hit the asteroid and did not stop. It did not impact the surface and start boring in. It did not splash against the rock and dissipate. It entered the near side of the asteroid and came out the far side, and kept traveling into empty space until Katie released the firing control and cut the beam. We all stared at the asteroid in silence as it slowly, almost gracefully, split apart along the line our weapon had carved through its core. 300 meters of iron and stone, divided like a loaf of bread, the two halves drifting gently apart in the vacuum. Owen's voice came over the communicator from somewhere deep in the engineering decks. He sounded annoyed. He said every power coupling on Deck 6 had just blown simultaneously, and he was going to need about 20 minutes and some choice words to fix them. Katie did not seem to hear him. She was staring at her weapons console with the expression of a person who has just realized they are holding something very, very dangerous. She said that every species in the galaxy calibrated their defensive shields based on known Veldron weapon frequencies. Those frequencies had not changed in centuries because Veldron crystals did not change. The entire galactic shield paradigm was built on the assumption that Veldron weapons were predictable. Our weapons were no longer predictable. Our weapons were no longer anything the galaxy had seen before. I sat in the captain's chair and felt the magnitude of that realization settle over me like a heavy blanket. We had not just fixed a broken ship. We had accidentally created a weapons system that could bypass every known defensive technology in the galaxy. Not through superior engineering, not through a breakthrough in physics, through a crack in a crystal that nobody had thought to look at twice. Lena came up from the drive room and stood beside me on the bridge. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the slowly separating halves of what used to be an asteroid. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said the Veldron had spent centuries perfecting their technology, eliminating every flaw, removing every variable, making everything pure and clean and precise and predictable. And in all that time, across all those centuries, and all those brilliant engineers, and all those perfect crystals, they had never once considered what would happen if their perfect crystal broke. Because perfection does not break. That was their axiom. That was their blind spot. They had never explored the possibilities of imperfection, because their entire civilization was built on avoiding it. Humans are different, she said. We live with imperfection every single day. We break things. We get broken ourselves. And then we put ourselves and our tools back together, with whatever we have on hand, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the thing we rebuild is stronger, and stranger, and more capable than the thing that broke. Not because we are smarter, because we are more comfortable with damage. We know what it looks like. We know what it can become. The Veldron saw a flaw. We saw potential. And now we were sitting inside that potential, armed with weapons nobody had defenses against, powered by an engine nobody could outrun, held together by polymer resin, human software, redundant circuitry, and the absolute stubborn refusal to accept that broken means dead. Pete turned from his console and asked where we were going next. I told him to take us back to Kovacs Station. We needed supplies, proper repairs, and a meal that did not come out of a printer. But even as I said it, I knew that our window of anonymity was closing fast. A ship like the Junkyard Dog could not stay secret for long. The energy signatures from our weapons test alone would be detectable across half a light year. Someone would notice. Someone would analyze. Someone would realize that a crew of 6 humans was flying a Veldron cruiser, faster and harder than the Veldron themselves had ever thought possible. And when they did, the Veldron were going to want their corpse back. The crystal hummed beneath my feet, rough and broken and alive, and the junkyard dog carried us through the stars toward home. I was right about the attention. I just did not expect it to come so fast or so formally. 3 weeks after our weapons test, while we were still docked at Kovac Station running repairs and debugging the persistent gravity inversion problem on Deck 4, Nate intercepted a coded Veldron diplomatic transmission on the ship's long-range communication array. Under normal circumstances, he should not have been able to read Veldron encrypted communications. Their cipher technology was considered unbreakable by galactic intelligence agencies, but the Sethys Vaughn's communication system still had their original Veldron decryption keys loaded in the database, because when the Veldron stripped the ship before abandoning it, they removed the classified data cores but left the routine operating systems intact. Nobody had thought to wipe the encryption keys because nobody had imagined a human would be sitting at the communications console reading their mail. The message was a formal diplomatic dispatch addressed to the Galactic Concord Assembly. The Veldron government was filing an official demand for the immediate return of the vessel designated Sethys Vaughn. They were no longer calling it abandoned. They were now describing it as decommissioned military hardware temporarily stored in the Kessner Drift, pending scheduled retrieval. Under Concord regulations, decommissioned military assets had different salvage protections than abandoned civilian vessels. They were also claiming that the ship contained classified Veldron military technology that represented an unacceptable security risk in the hands of an unauthorized species. My hands, my species, my ship. Nate showed me the message with a grim expression. He said the Veldron were rewriting history. 3 months ago, their own liaison had told us the ship was a worthless corpse. Now it was classified military hardware with scheduled retrieval plans that conveniently had no paper trail. I said I knew what they were doing. They did not care about the hull. They did not care about the crystal they had called garbage. They cared about what we had proved. A human crew had taken Veldron technology that the Veldron themselves had declared beyond salvation, and had made it more powerful than anything in their active fleet. That was not just a military problem. It was an existential embarrassment. The Veldron built their entire galactic reputation on the superiority of their engineering. If a gang of broke human salvagers could surpass them using one of their own broken ships, what did that say about Veldron's superiority? It said it was a myth. And myths, once broken, are harder to repair than crystals. 2 days after Nate intercepted the dispatch, we received a formal summons from the Galactic Concord. The junkyard dog and its entire crew were ordered to present themselves at Concord Station for an ownership hearing. Failure to appear would result in the Concord authorizing the Veldron government to reclaim the vessel by any means they deemed appropriate. Any means. The diplomatic language was polite. The implication was not. I sat in the captain's chair and looked at the summons on my screen and thought about what to do. We had 3 options, and none of them were good. We could run. The junkyard dog was the fastest ship in the galaxy. Nothing the Veldron had could catch us. But running meant becoming fugitives, and fugitives do not get to dock at stations, buy supplies, or live any kind of life that involves not constantly looking over their shoulders. Running was survival, but not living. We could surrender the ship, hand it back, walk away, go back to scraping by on the debt collector. That was the safe option. The smart option, probably, but it meant admitting that humans did not have the right to improve what other species had thrown away. It meant accepting that broken things belonged to whoever broke them, not whoever fixed them. It meant telling the galaxy that when a bigger species tells you to give something back, you give it back and say thank you. I was not willing to send that message. The third option was to go to Concord Station, stand in front of the entire Galactic Assembly, and make our case. Argue that salvage law was clear. Argue that we had the right. Argue that fixing something nobody else wanted did not make us thieves. I chose the third option, not because I was confident we would win, because Danny Cole does not run from a fight he believes in, and because I was angry, in the particular way that comes from knowing you are being treated unjustly and being expected to accept it with a smile. We flew to Concord Station. Concord Station is the diplomatic capital of the galaxy, and it is designed to make you feel small. It sits at the gravitational center of a 5-star system called the Harmony Cluster, a location chosen centuries ago because it belongs to no single species. The station itself is an enormous rotating ring structure nearly 40 kilometers in diameter, jointly built and maintained by all member species of the Galactic Concord. Every species has an embassy. Every major interstellar dispute goes through its central assembly chamber. It is supposed to be neutral territory. It did not feel neutral when we arrived. There were 4 Veldron warships in orbit around the station, not docked at embassy berths, orbiting, in formation. Their crystalline hulls caught the light of the 5 suns and refracted it into patterns that would have been strikingly beautiful if I had not known that each of those ships carried enough particle lance arrays to reduce a small moon to rubble. They were not there for the hearing. They were there as a statement, a reminder to everyone in the system about who the Veldron were and what they were capable of. I docked the junkyard dog at the human embassy's designated berth, which was roughly 1/50th the size of the Veldron embassy complex. I put on the cleanest jumpsuit I owned, which was the one with only 2 stains instead of 6. Pete stayed with the ship. The rest of us walked through the station's gleaming corridors to the assembly chamber. The chamber is designed to be impressive, and it succeeds entirely. It is a vast circular room with tiered seating rising in concentric rings, providing space for representatives of over 60 species. The ceiling is transparent, showing the stars and the slow rotation of the Harmony Cluster's 5 suns. The acoustics are engineered so that a whisper at the central podium carries clearly to the highest tier. I stood at the respondents' podium, a raised platform in the center of the room, and looked up at hundreds of alien faces in dozens of shapes and colors, all looking down at me. The Veldron delegation sat directly across from my position. There were 5 of them, tall, angular beings with iridescent skin that shifted color based on their emotional state. Their current color was a deep, cold blue that I had learned from Lena's cultural database meant tightly controlled anger. Their lead representative was a senior diplomat named Velthoran. When he rose to speak, the entire chamber fell silent, and I understood why the Veldron had dominated galactic politics for centuries. His presence alone commanded the room. He laid out the Veldron position with the precision of a surgeon. The Cethys Vaughn was Veldron military property. It had been decommissioned, not abandoned. Decommissioned vessels remained the legal property of their originating government under Concord Military Asset Protocol. The human salvage claim was therefore invalid on its face. Furthermore, the ship contained sensitive Veldron military technology, including propulsion and weapons systems whose operation by an unauthorized species constituted a threat to galactic security. He requested the immediate return of the vessel and the confiscation of all human modifications for security analysis. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture dramatically. He simply stated his case with absolute certainty, as if the outcome were already determined and this hearing was merely a formality required by politeness. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at that podium in my stained jumpsuit and looked at Velthoran across the chamber. I am not a diplomat. I am not a lawyer. I am a salvage engineer who fixes broken things for a living. So I spoke like one. I said the Cethys Vaughn was found drifting in the Kessner Drift with no active retrieval beacon, no distress signal, no claim marker, no scheduled recovery operation filed with any Concord registry. Under Concord Salvage Law, Article 9, Section 14, that constituted legal abandonment. I said the Veldron liaison at the nearest trade station had explicitly and on record confirmed that the vessel was considered irreparable and that the Veldron government had no interest in its return. I said I had the recorded communication available for the Assembly's review. I said we did not steal Veldron technology. We found something they threw away in a junk field. We fixed what they said was beyond fixing. Every modification on the junkyard dog was human-designed, human-built, human-coded, and human-maintained. The only Veldron things left were the hull and a cracked crystal they had officially declared to be garbage. Then I said the words I had been thinking about for days. the ones that mattered more than any legal citation. I said they did not lose a warship. They threw away a broken toy because it did not meet their standards of perfection. We picked it up and built something new from it. That is not theft. That is what humans do. We find what others discard, and we make it work. That is not a crime. That is a gift. The chamber was quiet for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then the murmuring started. Dozens of species whispering to each other in dozens of languages. A rising tide of conversation that washed through the tears. I could not tell if the reaction was sympathetic or hostile. Velthoran's skin color shifted from deep blue to a pale, almost translucent shade I had not seen before. He stared at me without expression, and then the assembly chair called a recess for deliberation. During the recess, I stepped into the corridor outside the chamber to breathe air that did not taste like alien politics and anxiety. That is when Velthoran found me. He came alone, no guards, no aides, no staff, just a single tall, luminous alien in flowing diplomatic robes, standing in a human-standard corridor and looking down at a man in a stained jumpsuit. His skin was that pale, translucent shade, and when he spoke, his voice was soft enough that no one passing in the corridor could have overheard. He said the hearing was a courtesy. He said the Veldron had already positioned military assets to recover the vessel, regardless of how the assembly voted. He said I was a practical man and should understand the practical reality of the situation. He suggested I return the ship voluntarily and avoid what he called complications. I asked what kind of complications. He said the kind that small species are not equipped to navigate. I looked at him for a long time. I thought about the 4 warships orbiting outside. I thought about my crew of 6 people on a ship held together with glue and improvised code. I thought about every species in that chamber who had just watched a small human in a dirty jumpsuit stand up to one of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy with nothing but a legal argument and raw stubbornness. I told him no. Something changed in his expression. It was brief, barely perceptible, but it was there. I do not think it was respect. I think it was confusion. Genuine confusion. In his experience, in the Veldron understanding of how the galaxy worked, when a superior force told you to step aside, you stepped aside. That was rational. That was logical. That was how reasonable beings behaved. I was not being reasonable. I was being human, and in that moment, I think Velthoran began to understand that those two things were very different. I walked back to the docking berth and told my crew to prepare the ship for departure. The hearing was adjourned without a ruling. That should have bought us time. It did not. We undocked from Concord Station and followed the standard departure corridor, slow and steady, making no moves that could be interpreted as aggressive. The 4 Veldron warships maintained their orbit, and I watched them on the sensor display while my pulse counted the seconds. We were 11 minutes out from the station's protective perimeter when Nate said 3 new contacts had appeared on sensors. They had not jumped in from FTL. They had been there already, running silent, hidden in the sensor shadow of the station's own mass. They had powered up simultaneously and were now on intercept vectors, converging on our position from 3 directions. Veldron interceptors, light, fast, purpose-built for rapid engagement and target seizure. Not a battle fleet, a snatch team, the kind of force you deploy when you want to take something quickly, quietly, and deniably. If it works, you claim it was a routine asset recovery. If anyone asks questions, there is no evidence of aggression. They hailed us. The message was short and clear: cut engines, power down weapons, prepare for boarding. Comply, and the safety of your crew is guaranteed. I looked at Pete. He looked back at me. His hands were steady on the controls, but his eyes were asking the question. Katie was already at the weapons console, her fingers resting near the firing controls. Owen was somewhere in the lower decks. Lena was in the drive room. Nate was watching 3 bright red dots on his sensor screen, closing the distance between us and a very bad day. 3 warships against 1. Fully crewed Veldron military vessels against 6 humans on a ship held together with resin and determination. On paper, it was not a contest. But we were not on paper. We were on the junkyard dog. And the junkyard dog did not know how to quit. I told Pete to spin up the crystal. He smiled. It was not a cheerful smile. It was the expression of a man who has made peace with the fact that the next few minutes are going to be very intense and possibly final, and has decided to face them head-on anyway. Katie brought the weapons online. The ship shuddered as the fractured crystals spun up to combat power levels, that deep, rough growl vibrating through every deck, every wall, every surface on the ship. Nate's adaptive software flashed warnings across every console, as the harmonic fluctuations spiked into ranges it had never handled at this intensity. The three interceptors adjusted their approach vectors. They had expected compliance. They had expected a salvage crew to see 3 warships and surrender. Instead, the broken ship they had come to collect was powering its weapons and charging its drives, and for the first time, the approaching vessels showed a moment of hesitation in their formation spacing. They had built ships that never failed. We had built ours from something that already had, and it was awake now, and it was fast, and it was not going to roll over and die for anyone. I said 2 words to my crew. All teeth. And the junkyard dog bared them. The first interceptor fired before we did. A clean, bright lance of focused energy that crossed the gap between us in less than a heartbeat, aimed with surgical precision at our drive section. It was standard Veldron engagement doctrine. Take out the engines first, then board at leisure while the target drifts helplessly. It was textbook. It was what they taught in every Veldron military academy. Against any other ship in the galaxy, it would have been the beginning of the end. The beam hit our shields and shattered into a spray of harmless light. That single moment, that fraction of a second, when a Veldron weapons beam struck the junkyard dog's shields and simply failed to penetrate, was the moment the galaxy changed. Because our shields were running on the same chaotic, multi-frequency harmonics as every other system on the ship. The shield emitters were cycling through dozens of resonance frequencies hundreds of times per second, driven by the fractured crystal's complex harmonic output and managed by Nate's adaptive software. The shield surface never held one frequency long enough for a frequency-locked weapon to find the resonance match needed to punch through. It was like trying to kick down a door that kept changing its position every millisecond. Centuries of galactic military technology, centuries of carefully calibrated weapons and precisely tuned shields, overturned in 1 second by a cracked crystal and a software patch written by a man who had not slept properly in a month. Katie fired back. The forward lance array lit up, and the beam that reached across the vacuum was nothing like the Veldron's precise, elegant shot. It shimmered and wavered, shifting frequencies faster than any sensor could track, looking almost unstable, as if it might fly apart at any moment. It hit the lead interceptor's shields, and it went through them the way a hot knife goes through ice cream. The interceptor's port engine section exploded outward, hull plating tore away, plasma and atmosphere vented in bright plumes that froze instantly in the vacuum. The ship spun out of its attack formation, tumbling end over end, its remaining engine fighting to stabilize a vessel that had just lost a third of its propulsion capability. It was still alive, still functional as a vessel, but it was no longer a warship. It was a casualty, crippled in a single shot. A ship designed to absorb sustained bombardment for extended engagements had been opened up in under a second. Its shields, calibrated over centuries to counter known weapon frequencies, had encountered a frequency that did not exist in any database, any threat assessment, any tactical manual in the galaxy. The shields had tried to match the incoming energy, and failed because the incoming energy refused to be one thing long enough to be matched. Katie said one word under her breath. She said yes. Then she was already rotating the lance array toward the second interceptor, her hands moving across the console with the focused intensity of someone who has found exactly the thing they were built to do. But the Veldron were not amateurs. Their pilots had trained for decades. They had fought across dozens of systems. They adapted faster than I expected. The remaining 2 interceptors broke their formation immediately, splitting wide in opposite directions, coming at us from 2 vectors simultaneously. It forced Katie to choose a target, which meant the other interceptor could attack from outside her firing arc. It was sound tactics. It was exactly the right response to an opponent with superior firepower, but only one weapons operator. Pete did not give them time to execute it. He shoved the sublight throttle to maximum, and the junkyard dog surged forward with an acceleration that should have been physically impossible for a ship of its mass. The cracked crystal howled in the drive room, a sound that came through 3 decks of hull plating and filled the bridge with vibration. Every display flickered. For one terrible heartbeat, the gravity on the bridge inverted, and I lifted off the deck plates, floating for a second of weightless disorientation before the system corrected and slammed me back down so hard my knees buckled. But the burst of speed accomplished what Pete intended. It threw off the interceptor's pincer timing completely. Their carefully coordinated approach collapsed as the junkyard dog drove straight at the second interceptor at a velocity that turned their measured tactical engagement into a close-range brawl. The second interceptor's pilot had to make a choice. He could hold his course and risk a head-on engagement with a ship whose weapons had just torn through his wingman's shields like tissue paper, or he could break off and reposition, giving up his attack angle but gaining distance and time. He chose to evade. The interceptor rolled hard to starboard, engines flaring as the pilot tried to open the range and swing around for a safer approach vector. It was the cautious choice, the professional choice. It was the wrong choice. The moment the interceptor committed to its evasive turn, it presented its dorsal hull to Katie's firing arc for approximately 3 seconds. 3 seconds was more than enough. Katie fired a sustained burst that raked across the interceptor's upper shields. The shields held for about 2 seconds. I know because I counted. Then they collapsed, and the beam carved a line across the interceptor's dorsal hull from bow to midship, slicing through armor plating and exterior systems with the casual ease of a finger drawn through sand. Atmosphere vented from 3 separate hull breaches. The interceptor's weapons array went dark as power conduits were severed. The ship was still intact, still pressurized in its core sections, but it was finished as a combat vessel. 2 interceptors disabled, 1 remaining. The third pilot was smarter than the others, or more cautious, or perhaps simply a faster learner. Instead of closing to engagement range, he pulled back to maximum weapons distance and began circling our position in a wide, high-speed orbit. He fired rapid, short bursts rather than sustained beams, each shot aimed at a different section of our ship, probing our shield coverage from every angle. He was not trying to overwhelm our defenses with raw power. He was testing for weak points, looking for patterns in our shield frequency cycling, trying to find the rhythm in Nate's adaptive software so he could time a shot to slip through during a transition. It was patient, it was methodical, it was extremely dangerous. Because the truth that nobody on my crew had spoken aloud was that the junkyard dog was not invincible. We were powerful, yes. Our weapons could slice through Veldron shields. Our engines could outrun their fastest ships. But every system on our ship ran through a fractured crystal that was slowly, incrementally dying, and every full-power engagement accelerated that process. Every weapons burst, every shield impact, every moment of combat-level output burned through the crystal's remaining structural integrity. Owen was already calling from the lower decks, his voice tight with controlled urgency, telling me that power couplings had blown on 2 decks, that the port shield emitter was degrading, that the crystal's fracture patterns were showing new stress lines that had not been there before the fight started. We were strong, but we were also fragile in a way the Veldron were not. Their ships could fight for hours without degradation. Ours was consuming itself with every minute of combat. The pilot of that third interceptor seemed to sense this, whether through tactical analysis or pure instinct, and his strategy reflected it. He was not trying to beat us in a straight fight. He was trying to exhaust us, drain the crystal, wait for the system holding us together to stutter and leave an opening. The circling continued. Each burst from the interceptor forced Nate's software to recalculate, forced the shields to adapt, forced the crystal to output more energy. Each adaptation cost processing power. Each cycle of processing drew power from the crystal. The margins were small individually, but they accumulated, and I could feel them accumulating in the way the ship's vibration deepened slightly, in the way the lights dimmed fractionally with each impact, in the way Nate's expression grew tighter as he watched his system resource monitors climb toward limits he had not expected to approach this quickly. I needed to end this fight now. Not soon, now. I called Lena in the drive room on the internal communicator. I asked her a question I already knew the answer to but needed to hear her say it out loud. I asked if the FTL drive could be engaged for a micro jump inside the combat zone. Not a full jump, not even a short jump. A microburst, 0.3 seconds of superluminal travel, just enough to reposition the ship instantaneously within a small area. A combat blink. Lena was quiet for 4 seconds. When she spoke, her voice was very calm, in the way that people's voices get calm when they are describing something genuinely terrifying. She said it was theoretically possible. The drive could spin up and engage for a fractional jump. But the stress on the crystal would be extreme. A micro jump required bringing the crystal to full FTL output and then cutting it almost instantly, which meant slamming the harmonic output from 0 to maximum and back to 0 in less than a second. The thermal shock, the vibrational stress, the sudden compression and release of the fracture lines would cost the equivalent of 30 to 50 standard FTL jumps worth of crystal degradation in a single moment. She said there was a meaningful probability that the crystal would shatter entirely. I asked her to give me numbers. She said roughly 70-30 in favor of survival. I asked if she had a better idea. She said she did not. 70-30. Those were the best odds anyone had offered me all day. In the salvage business, I had taken worse odds for smaller rewards. I told Pete the plan. He turned in the pilot's chair and looked at me with an expression that combined professional admiration with genuine incredulity. Then, without saying a word, he turned back to his console and began programming the jump coordinates. The third interceptor was on our port quarter, still circling, still firing those patient, probing bursts. Its pilot had found a rhythm, and rhythms are predictable. I watched the interceptor's track on the sensor display, the bright red dot tracing its orbital path around our position. I watched the pattern, the spacing of its attack runs, the moments when it committed to its approach vector and its maneuverability was briefly constrained. I waited. The interceptor lined up for another pass. Its nose turned toward us. Its engines flared for the approach run. For one moment, it was committed. Moving toward us on a fixed vector, closing the distance, all its energy directed forward. I said now. Pete engaged the micro jump. The crystal screamed. That is the only word for it. The sound that came from the drive room was not a mechanical noise, not the hum or the growl or the rough chord we had grown familiar with. It was a scream, a high, sharp, agonizing frequency that cut through the hull and filled every space on the ship with a sound I felt in the marrow of my bones. The lights went out completely. The gravity failed. For a fraction of a second that stretched into what felt like eternity, I was weightless in absolute darkness, with nothing but that terrible, beautiful scream and the feeling of the universe folding around me like a piece of paper being creased. Then light returned. Gravity grabbed me and threw me against the deck. The view screen came back online with a burst of static that resolved into clarity. We were behind the interceptor. Not just behind it. Inside its shield perimeter. So close that I could see individual hull plates on the interceptor's engine section through the forward viewport without magnification. We were closer to that ship than its own crew were to its stern. The Veldron pilot had been tracking us on sensors, calculating his next attack pass against a target at a specific location, and that target had simply ceased to exist in one place and materialized in another. In the one place no shield, no weapon, and no tactical doctrine could protect against. The pilot had no time to react. There was no evasion possible at this range. There was no shield adjustment that mattered when the threat was already inside the shield boundary. There was nothing between the junkyard dog's forward lance array and the interceptor's unprotected engine section, except a few hundred meters of empty vacuum. Katie fired. At this range, at this proximity, the beam did not need to be at full power. A single, brief pulse punched through the interceptor's rear hull plating and found something vital inside. The stern of the ship erupted outward, a silent blossom of light and debris and venting atmosphere that expanded in slow motion in the vacuum. The interceptor shuddered, rolled slowly onto its side, and began to drift. Its engines were dark. Its weapons were offline. Life support was probably still functioning in the forward sections, keeping the crew alive. But the ship was no longer a warship. It was wreckage with a heartbeat. It was what the Veldron would have called a corpse. 3 interceptors engaged. 3 interceptors neutralized. Pete pulled us away from the expanding debris field with gentle thruster bursts, and the bridge was quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The quiet of people who have been very close to the edge of something permanent and have stepped back. and are still processing the fact that they are alive, and the universe is still here. The alarms were still blaring. The emergency lighting cast everything in a red-orange glow. Half the consoles on the bridge were showing error codes. The air smelled like ozone and hot metal, and something faintly sweet from the crystal's overtone emissions. My head was pounding from a cut above my left eyebrow that I did not remember getting, and there was blood running down the side of my face in a thin line that I kept wiping away with my sleeve. Owen's voice came over the communicator from the engine room. He sounded exhausted. He said we had blown power couplings on 4 more decks. The port shield emitter was down to 30% effectiveness and would need to be completely rebuilt. The hull had stress fractures along 2 structural ribs, and the crystal's fracture network had extended significantly. Lena was in the drive room, running emergency stabilization procedures, flooding the new fractures with a second application of polymer resin. He paused, and then he said, Lena was crying. He said he was pretty sure they were relief tears, but he could not be completely certain. Nate pulled up the crystal status on his console. Before the fight, Lena had estimated the crystal had roughly 200 full-power engagements remaining in its lifespan. After the fight, including the micro-jump, that number was down to approximately 140. We had burned through nearly a third of our ship's remaining operational life in less than 15 minutes of combat. But we had won. The 3 interceptors drifted in the debris field. One was transmitting a distress signal on standard Veldron emergency frequencies. The other 2 were dark and silent. The 4 Veldron warships near Concord Station had not moved from their orbit, which confirmed what I had suspected. The interceptor ambush had been an unofficial operation. Deniable. Off the books. If the interception had succeeded, the Veldron would have recovered their ship and presented it to the Concord as a routine military asset retrieval. But it had failed. Failed publicly, failed spectacularly, and failed on camera, because Concord Station's monitoring satellites had been recording every ship movement in the system throughout the hearing proceedings. Every species in the Concord was about to watch the footage. One human-crewed ship, cobbled together from salvage and stubbornness, manned by 6 people in a vessel designed for 200, had dismantled a Veldron tactical formation, had defeated 3 purpose-built interceptors crewed by trained military professionals using ships with intact crystals and flawless systems, had done it with glue and improvised software and a cracked crystal that was supposed to be dead. The Concord assembly reconvened 4 hours later. I was not present. I was on the bridge of my battered, bleeding, creaking ship, holding a cold compress against the cut on my forehead and listening to the proceedings through the diplomatic communication channel. Velteron spoke first. His voice was controlled, measured, stripped of the menace he had shown in the corridor. He called the engagement an unfortunate misunderstanding. He said the interceptors had been conducting a routine patrol and had not been authorized to engage the human vessel. He said the Veldron remained committed to peaceful resolution through proper diplomatic channels. Nobody in the chamber believed him. I could tell from the quality of the silence that followed his statement. It was not the respectful silence that follows a credible statement. It was the uncomfortable silence that follows an obvious lie that everyone recognizes, but no one wants to be the first to call out. The assembly chair called for a vote on the ownership dispute. 37 species voted to uphold the human salvage claim. 12 abstained. 8 voted with the Veldron. The motion carried. The junkyard dog was legally and officially ours. But the legal ruling was not the thing that mattered to the galaxy. The thing that mattered was the combat footage. Within hours of the vote, every intelligence agency, every military planning division, every strategic analysis group for every species in the Galactic Concord had received, analyzed, and disseminated the engagement data. And the conclusion was the same everywhere, in every language, on every world. Humans had taken a piece of alien technology that was considered worthless, broken beyond salvation, fit only for abandonment. They had rebuilt it with methods that no other species would have considered appropriate. They had used adhesive compounds, improvised software, redundant hardware salvaged from inferior human systems, and raw determination. And the result was a vessel that could outrun and outfight anything in the known galaxy. Not because humans were inherently smarter than the Veldron, not because human technology was superior, but because humans solved problems differently. Where the Veldron saw a terminal defect, the humans saw raw material. Where the Veldron demanded perfection or nothing, the humans embraced imperfection and found unexpected power inside it. The message that rippled across the galaxy was not about one ship or one skirmish. It was about what happens when you underestimate the species that evolved on a harsh, unpredictable world, where nothing works perfectly, and everything breaks, and the survivors are the ones who learn to build from the wreckage. Do not give humans your broken things. They will fix them. And what they fix will be stronger than what you built. Nate told me about the vote result while I was still sitting on the bridge. I nodded. Then I stood up, slowly because everything hurt, and walked to the forward viewport. The stars looked the same as they always did, cold, distant, indifferent to the affairs of small beings on small ships in the vast emptiness between them. The junkyard dog was battered. Half our systems were running on backup power. The crystal was dying incrementally, every day a little closer to the end of its extraordinary, unplanned second life. I knew that someday, whether in a year or 10 years or somewhere in between, the fractures would spread beyond what resin could stabilize, and the harmonic output would falter, and the rough, broken chord that had become the heartbeat of our ship would finally go silent. We could not prevent that. We could only make the time we had count for something. Lena came up to the bridge. Her eyes were red. Her hands were trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion, and the emotional aftermath of holding a dying crystal together through a combat engagement that should not have been survivable. But she was smiling. She stood beside me at the viewport and looked out at the same stars. She asked me what happens next. I said I did not know exactly. I said the Veldron would not forget what happened. I said there would be political consequences, diplomatic maneuvering, and probably more confrontations down the road. I said the crystal was living on borrowed time, and the ship was held together with materials and methods that would make a proper engineer weep. I said we were 6 people doing the work of 200, on a vessel that by all rational analysis should not exist, in a galaxy that had just learned to take us seriously for the first time. She said she knew all of that already. She asked me again, "What happens next?" I looked at the stars. I felt the crystal humming beneath my feet, that rough, broken, layered chord that was unlike anything else in the universe, the sound of something that should have been dead and was not, singing its fractured song into the dark. I said we keep going. That is what we do. That is what humans have always done, from the first time one of our ancestors picked up a broken stick and figured out how to use it as a tool. We find the broken things, the discarded things, the abandoned things, the things that the rest of the universe has given up on, and we pick them up, and we fix them, not perfectly, not elegantly, but we fix them enough to work, enough to fight, enough to fly, and we give them names, and we ride them into the unknown, with our eyes open, and our hands steady, and our hearts beating too fast and too loud, because that is the only way we know how to face the dark. The galaxy builds things to last. We build things that fight, and when they break, we do not leave them where they fall. We hold them together with whatever we have, and we keep going, and we make the darkness regret looking away. That is not engineering. That is not strategy. That is not the product of superior intelligence or advanced civilization, or centuries of careful planning. That is just human. And the junkyard dog, scarred and battered and burning through the last reserves of its impossible, magnificent, broken heart, carried us forward into whatever came next. We were not afraid. We had work to do.